I would like to introduce you to 4-year-old Luis, who I met last year in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. His family, which is Christian, fled Mosul in 2014. His morning in a displaced persons camp near Erbil is much like the mornings of countless children around the world. His mother gets him bathed and fed. His father walks him to school, where a Catholic nun warmly greets him. But before leaving the caravan they call home, his mother takes a small tube of oil and marks his forehead with the sign of the cross. When she's finished, Luis takes the tube and marks her forehead as well. And on the morning I was there, he motioned to me to bend over, and he marked my forehead with a cross. Donald Trump is right. Immigrants are dangerous. They can bless us, anoint us, change us. As we encounter those who wander as refugees and displaced persons at the margins of our communities, we may meet angels, or even Jesus. And as we reach out to bless with our meager attempts at mercy, Jesus reaches back with the hands of the refugee, marked with the stigmata of their own displacement, to mark our foreheads, and thus claim us for the building of the beloved community. This is an important dynamic for the people in our churches, your churches, bishops, to understand. We too often see immigrants and refugees as just objects needing our charity. I want you to challenge this paternalistic narrative and help the people in your episcopal areas to see the encounter with immigrants as an opportunity for our own conversion anew to the gospel of Jesus Christ. In other words, don't just pass the hat for UMCOR. Lead your people in embracing the stranger. There are a lot of people to embrace in our world today. More than 65 million are forcibly displaced. They are refugees, internally displaced people, and the stateless. And their life is hard. If you're lucky, there's a camp. But no one who has lived in a refugee camp will tell you that they want to live there long term. A couple of years ago, I wanted to go back to Darfur to look for some people I had photographed there years earlier. Khartoum refused to grant me a visa, however, but we managed to get a British photographer in. She found a handful of people I had photographed, and the BBC published the before and after series showing the effects of long-term displacement on real human beings. Here's Hamisa, a woman I had met in the Hamidiyya IDP camp in 2007, and here she is just 7 years later. When we debate refugee policy and people say, "Oh, we'll just build a camp and keep them there," they don't understand what kind of punishment that is. God did not make people to live in displacement camps. In Jordan, most Syrians in the giant Zaatari refugee camp would love to get out. Although the tents are being replaced by caravans, which people make the best of, and food lines are being replaced by supermarkets, and several church agencies work in the camp to make it a better environment for children, it is still a camp. This family got out of Zaatari when they could and moved into a Palestinian refugee camp, where they told me they felt welcomed and loved by people who had themselves experienced long separation from their homes. That support from their new neighbors allows some kind of normal life to go on. It wasn't the huge UN and NGO bureaucracy that made them feel at home. It was ordinary people who remembered that they had been refugees in Egypt and so offered their homes and lives to others. 2 years ago, when hundreds of thousands of refugees started flowing toward Western Europe, governments and NGOs were caught flat-footed. Again, it was ordinary people, farmers and fishers on places like Lesbos, who welcomed the refugees, and with volunteers from all over Europe, engineers from Norway, lifeguards from Spain, nurses from the UK, who quickly organized themselves on Facebook, pulled the drowning refugees from the sea, and hugged their shivering bodies. Such a massive outpouring of solidarity wasn't enough, however, and many refugees didn't make it. This boy had new shoes, and we can imagine they were bought with the excitement of his family setting off to find a new life far from war. Yet when I found him one morning on a rocky beach in Greece, the Aegean had taken away one of those new shoes, just as it took away his dream of living somewhere, anywhere, in peace. Refugees and the displaced are not always welcomed, however, with open arms. In Hungary, the government was at times willing to tolerate the passage of refugees only as long as they kept moving to somewhere else. That sentiment is growing today in other parts of Europe. In Kenya, the welcome for Somalis in the world's largest refugee settlement in Dadaab is wearing thin, and Kenya has repeatedly pushed to close it. In the United States, President Trump successfully leveraged xenophobia into a campaign tactic in a way that we have not witnessed since the middle of the 19th century, when the Know Nothing Party made Irish immigrants the scapegoat for every conceivable social ill. Yet Trump's policies, abhorrent as they are, represent little change for many immigrants in North America. President Obama had earned the title Deporter-in-Chief by flying hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants back home, many to certain death in the violent northern triangle of Central America. These refugees are being deported back to Honduras, where they get their belts and shoelaces returned to them, and an overworked crew of church volunteers talks to them about what they might need to stay home. What many of them need is peace, and in its absence they will soon venture north again. And those who come to the U.S. seeking asylum, if not sent home immediately, are often allowed to remain only if they wear ankle monitors, as if they were criminals. These devices are sold and monitored by private corporations that have turned the repression of immigrants into a profitable business, and who continually lobby the government to maintain border policies that will benefit their shareholders. Some 10 million of the world's displaced are stateless. Like these Haitian immigrants in the Dominican Republic, they have no legal status, and thus are subject to exploitation without recourse. In Asia, almost 2 million Rohingya are effectively stateless. Although the Rohingya have lived in Myanmar for generations, growing Buddhist extremism, coupled with stubborn militarism and Chinese investments in Rakhine State, have created a consensus that the Rohingya are simply not Burmese, that they are best Bangladeshi and at worst a form of vermin. Yet Bangladesh doesn't claim the Rohingya either, and doesn't particularly want them in their already overcrowded country. And so the Rohingya have become stateless, most of them living for now in primitive camps in southern Bangladesh, where I took these photographs last week. I should note that while the government of Bangladesh has responded well overall, it refuses to call the Rohingya refugees, as under international law that would obligate them to offer certain conditions. Instead, it refers to the Rohingya as displaced Myanmar nationals and hopes they'll soon go home. Trouble is, that's not going to happen. No one wants the Rohingya. This ethnic cleansing in Myanmar didn't emerge from nowhere. Ask just about anyone in Myanmar today, including the leaders of the Methodist Church, what they think of the Rohingya, and they'll tell you how evil they are, how they should be driven out, how claims of genocide against them are simply fake news invented by Western human rights activists. The Burmese Church, as the Church Universal has been wont to do throughout history, has collaborated with this ideological campaign. Pope Francis will visit Myanmar later this month, and the country's bishops have asked him not to even mention the R word, to forget about the Rohingya. But Francis doesn't take orders easily, and in August he mentioned the Rohingya by name, calling them sisters and brothers and noting their suffering. Whether and how he uses the R word inside Myanmar will be closely watched. But as we watch Pope Francis, let us also watch our own language about migrants and refugees. What will we say? In the United States and Europe, it's easy to criticize the overt racism of neo-Nazi groups and the politicians who defend them. What's hard is to challenge the rhetoric of fear with words of solidarity and hope. You, our bishops, must speak words that unequivocally break through the stereotypes we apply to the other and help us to see the displaced not as threatening monsters or political pawns, but simply as sisters and brothers who hurt. Most of the world's displaced did not choose their fate. Many are driven from their homes by violence, and given global imbalances of power, protest usually gets them nowhere. Cambodians displaced by giant development projects are repressed if they protest. Indigenous groups in the Philippines have their leaders assassinated and are forced out of their traditional villages by giant mining operations, forced to take refuge in church compounds, including the United Methodist Church, as we saw in Kidapawan in 2016. In Brazil, the rural poor have their forest homes destroyed by loggers. Native peoples in Argentina lose their lands to giant fields where corporations grow soybeans for China. From one end of the earth to the other, people are forced to flee their homes in order to survive. When they resist, as these farmers resisted the theft of their land for palm oil plantations in Honduras, they pay a heavy price. Climate change is increasingly a contributor to migration. In Syria, long-term drought around Daraa displaced 1.5 million people, and discontent with how that was handled led to the first popular uprisings against Bashar al-Assad, surprisingly thrusting Syria into the Arab Spring and leading inexorably to the civil war today. Climate refugees will continue to increase in number even though they have no legal status under current international refugee law. We must add our voice to those calling for the Geneva Accords to be updated to reflect the reality of our deteriorating planet. Although the actions of governments, corporations, and climate change force people to move, in most places where they go, again, it is ordinary people who welcome them with hospitality. In South Africa, when refugees from Zimbabwe faced a campaign of xenophobic attacks, they found sanctuary in the Central Methodist Mission in Johannesburg. In the southwestern United States, volunteers patrol the desert with water to offer to thirsty refugees from the urban killing fields of Central America. Many of those immigrants don't make it, and their families spend years searching for them. Usually their search is in vain because their loved ones fell from a train or was murdered by drug cartels or disappeared into the evil web of human traffickers. But every once in a while there's a happy ending, as when Santos de Socorro Rojas from Nicaragua found her son Jorge in Mexico after 9 years of searching. In the U.S., United Methodist people stand with victims of immigration raids. They put together backpacks for asylum seekers who were on the move, riding the bus through the night to their new homes. Church leaders take clear stands on the side of the poor. A church-sponsored community center in Washington State teaches new immigrants how to use local ingredients to cook, just as a church program in Virginia teaches refugee children the wonders of joining 4-H and raising goats and sheep. And a resettlement program in North Carolina teaches newly arrived refugees how to ride bikes. Although we have big agencies charged with humanitarian response, it's often ordinary people who carry out the mission of the church, such as these Methodist women in Mexico who share food with Cuban immigrants stuck on the U.S.-Mexican border, such as a Methodist laywoman in Austria who teaches language to newly arrived migrant boys.
Tomaten. Und jetzt gelb, aber sonst weiß. Was ist das? Ja? Zwiebel. Das ist der Deckel. Deckel. Diese gelben Dinger, das sind Kichererbsen.
This is the story everywhere. In the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, these ordinary women, Christian, Muslim, and Druze, work together to provide food for war-weary refugees from Syria. What's notable about this hospitality is just how common it is. People and congregations don't endlessly debate whether they should practice hospitality. Instead, they just do what needs to be done.
My name is Rolf Held. I am the local Methodist minister here in Meßstetten and in Albstadt-Ebingen, a town 10 kilometers from here. And I was a pastor in a rural church here, very quiet. We enjoyed doing the things one did in Germany, drinking a beer, watching football, celebrating services on Sunday, and caring for about our own thing. And then last year we got the news that the army barracks here in Meßstetten, which had been empty for a year, were going to take in refugees. They promised us a maximum of 1,000 refugees in a town of approximately 6,000 inhabitants. Yes, and now we have just over 3,500 refugees in this small little town, and it's been a very interesting process to see how the population reacts to it. This is a very rural place, far away from the big cities. They've never seen much of the big wild world around them, and now it's dropped right in front of their doorstep. They've risen to the challenge. There's over 150 people doing voluntary work here, and the administration would never be able to cope without the people doing voluntary work. We're having interesting conversations with the refugees coming in. People are very different. We have mainly people from Syria, from Iraq, from Iran, Afghanistan, to a lesser degree from Eritrea in Africa. And we try to get to know the people, listen to their stories, find out how long it took them to get here, why they left home, what they experienced at home. Some of the experiences have been very harrowing and difficult to take in. And we found that we've met a lot of great people here. We have most of the people coming here are Muslims. We found they are very open. They come to our Christian services in our local Methodist church. A lot of them want to find out, what do Christians do? They come in. We do not try to convert each other. We try to speak with each other, share our faith, let each other know what we believe in and how we wish to live our faith. So we've been getting along very well. We've been finding that the refugees coming here are very, very helpful. We have a lady in our church. She has MS. She can hardly walk anymore. And she got befriended with some people from Iran. They washed her car, they painted her house, they fixed up her garden, they've packed up her cellar. They've come every day to see if they can help her. We've had this kind of helpfulness throughout the whole year. It's been an incredible experience how these people want to give back a little of what we try to convey to them.
There's not enough hospitality to go around, however. In South Sudan, more than 2 million people have been displaced by horrific fighting since 2013, often forced into the bush where they survive on wild leaves. While some have sought safety on United Nations bases, tens of thousands of others believe that the church offers literal salvation and have sought shelter in church compounds, sleeping in the open, trusting the church can be an island of peace in a veritable ocean of war. This is an Episcopal church compound in the city of Wau, where thousands of people were sleeping when I was there in April. 2 days after I captured these photos, the military forced them out. More than 10,000, however, remain sleeping on the grounds of the Catholic Cathedral in the same city. At great risk, church workers accompany the displaced, providing everything from education in the camps to disposal of unexploded ordnance in farmers' fields, to working with women who've returned from exile and want to get their farms started again, to communities of cattle keepers where violence has long been embedded in the popular culture, working to help them build skills to develop peace. South Sudan is a poster child for the complexity of refugee movements. Although millions of South Sudanese are on the run from war, the country also hosts refugees from conflicts elsewhere, including families who have fled Sudanese government bombings in the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile regions. Refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo, fleeing attacks from the Lord's Resistance Army, find sanctuary in the south of the country. Their South Sudanese neighbors, armed with bows and arrows, patrol the forest to keep the LRA at bay. The most recent refugee exodus from South Sudan comes as a result of the government's decision last year that the National Treasury held insufficient funds to pay its bloated army. So instead of pay, the SPLA sent its soldiers south to the previously unaffected Equatoria region. Instead of a paycheck, the troops were given license to rape and pillage Equatorian villages at will, and they did so, provoking a huge exodus of South Sudanese, including many United Methodists, across the border into Uganda, where, relatively speaking, they are well off, given the Ugandan government's focus on providing land to refugees rather than crowding them into camps. There are more refugees in the world today than at any time since World War II. Refugees are fleeing repression, conflict, and climate change, seeking a safe place to grow their crops and to raise their children. These are children of refugee families from South Sudan who fled civil war and famine for refuge in Uganda. They are surviving, indeed they're even thriving, thanks to the Global Health Unit of United Methodist Global Ministries, which supports life-saving work in refugee communities, providing safe drinking water and basic sanitation, as well as the delivery of medical care, including the treatment and prevention of malaria. The availability of safe water means women and girls no longer have to walk long distances. They can do other things. The delivery of health care, especially in remote locations far from clinics and hospitals, means healthy families are better able to support many of their own needs. Global Ministry supports prenatal care for refugee women.
It's painful. Is that painful? Okay.
As well as health education and critical medicines for their families. Because of Global Ministry's support, life for the refugees can go on. Uganda may not be their home, but at least for now, it's a safe place to live. Although far from home, the refugees can till and plant their small plots, growing food for their own use. There are many humanitarian crises in the world today, where ordinary people, their communities ravaged by war or drought, are engaged in extraordinary struggles to survive. With your help, the United Methodist Church can continue to accompany them until they return home in peace and unafraid. Although the Islamic State has been militarily defeated in northern Iraq, the massive displacement, particularly of Christians and Yazidis, is far from over. In January, I was in Mosul on the day the eastern portion of the city was liberated by Iraqi troops. Sunnis celebrated their newfound freedom, but looked warily on their Shia liberators. For Christians, their churches destroyed and their homes occupied by ISIS collaborators, the joy was muted. It's unlikely they will return to Mosul, instead strengthening the presence of Christian militias in the traditional Christian towns of the Nineveh Plain, places like Karakosh. Yet with the new fighting between the Peshmerga and the Iraqi army in recent weeks, the small Christian presence in the region will find even less reason to stick around, and many Christians will seek to emigrate to Sweden, Australia, and the United States if Donald Trump will let them in. Because of their connections to faith communities in other lands, displaced Christians in Iraq have been relatively fortunate. In most places, simply because they don't cross an international border, the internally displaced struggle to survive with a meager fraction of the help provided to official refugees. That's the case in the DRC, in Darfur, in Chad, in Colombia. Another face in the collage of global migration is the overseas worker. There can be a thin line between being forced by conflict to leave home and being compelled by hunger to seek work abroad. The Philippines, for example, stays afloat economically on the labor of the workers it exports, leaving broken families behind. The Church, particularly United Methodist Women, supports these overseas workers as they organize in places like Hong Kong, and back in the Philippines helps those who are survivors of sex trafficking to put their lives back together. Refugee displacements are steadily tending to last longer, and some refugees today linger seemingly forever in exile. Because of the continuing Israeli occupation, Palestinians remain trapped in a decades-long maelstrom of violence. In Gaza, home to some 1.25 million refugees, the Church provides critical support in healthcare, vocational training, and helping children cope with the trauma of war. though it would appear that the best way to help children get over war is to scare them with something else. Whether they linger for decades or pass quickly through our communities, refugees and displaced people remain a blessing for us. They offer us an opportunity to remember when we ourselves were exiles in Egypt. They offer us an opportunity to entertain angels, to know the Christ who comes to us in those at the margins. Nabil Minas is a Christian from Syria. I met him 2 years ago when the small boat he was in landed on Lesbos. First, he carried his daughters ashore, and when he was sure they were safe, hugged by a Norwegian volunteer, he knelt on the beach covered with deflated rubber rafts and prayed with thanksgiving. Nabil then arose and came and hugged his family, kissing the Norwegian woman, his wet clothes dripping water, as he wept and repeated over and over, "Shukran, shukran, thank you, thank you." He then came and hugged me, although all I was doing was taking photos. "Shukran," he told me, as his rough beard scraped my cheek and his wet clothes drenched me with the Aegean Sea. "Shukran," he said, weeping. "Thank you, thank you." As you bishops wrestle with these issues on our behalf, I bring you a word of thanks from so many people on the move today. Thanks for your acts of hospitality, your words of advocacy, your ministries of solidarity. Thanks for being open to encountering God as you and your people encounter the refugee, the displaced, and the stateless.